The maitre d' barely spared me a glance before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, madam, but there's no reservation under your name." For a moment I just blinked, caught completely off guard. "That's impossible," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I was invited to dinner with my husband's family. They should already be here." He offered me a courteous, almost apologetic expression. "I just checked, ma'am. There's a reservation for 6 under Morgan Sinclair, but I'm afraid." A sharp, familiar voice sliced through his sentence like a knife. "Oh, Claire," Morgan's tone rang out, sweetly venomous, dripping with amusement. "Did you really think I'd include you in tonight's dinner?" I turned slowly, my pulse tightening in my throat. There she was, my mother-in-law, standing just a few feet away, radiating the same cold elegance she wore like armor. Her platinum blonde hair was sculpted into perfection, her diamond earrings glittering under the chandelier's light. Seated behind her, my husband, Adam, sat stiffly, his posture too straight, his eyes darting nervously between us. He said nothing. Beside him, his sisters, Charlotte and Emma, leaned close, whispering behind manicured hands, smirking like schoolgirls sharing a cruel secret. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I don't understand." Morgan's smile widened, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, "I didn't actually think you'd come." She gave a soft, mocking laugh, as though I'd just made a harmless but ridiculous mistake. "This is a family dinner. And, well," her gaze swept over me slowly, deliberately, "a place like this is a bit out of your league, don't you think? Maybe a budget restaurant would suit you better." Charlotte giggled into her wine glass. Emma looked away, her lips twitching. And Adam, my husband, just sat there, gripping his fork tighter, jaw locked, eyes fixed on his plate. Silent. Always silent. The weight of humiliation pressed against my chest. I could feel the heat of judgment burning from every corner of the room, curious glances flicking toward our table, whispers forming behind crystal glasses. I should have seen this coming. Morgan Sinclair had spent years reminding me, subtly, cruelly, persistently, that I would never be good enough for her son. I wasn't born into their world of old money and polished manners. I hadn't attended the right schools, or belonged to the right social circles. From the moment Adam slipped that ring on my finger, Morgan had made it her mission to remind me that I was an outsider. And tonight, she'd finally made sure everyone else saw it too. Morgan had always gone out of her way to remind me that I didn't belong, but until tonight, she'd done it with subtlety. At first, it had been the passive-aggressive remarks disguised as compliments, the pointed comments about my simple tastes and humble background. Then came the conveniently forgotten invitations to family gatherings, the lavish gifts she'd shower upon Adam while handing me nothing but a polite smile and empty words. But tonight she had taken her cruelty to a whole new level. This wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated. She had deliberately arranged this family dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, knowing full well I'd arrive expecting a seat at the table, only to be left standing at the entrance like an uninvited guest. And she was enjoying every second of it. The humiliation should have stung. I should have felt small, crushed beneath the weight of her disdain. But instead, something inside me shifted, a quiet, deliberate click of realization. I smiled. A slow, measured smile that wiped the amusement from Morgan's face for the briefest moment. Then, turning toward the maitre d', I said calmly, "Would you be so kind as to ask the owner to come out?" Morgan let out a soft, mocking laugh, the kind she saved for people she thought beneath her. "Oh, please," she drawled. "Do you really think the owner of this place is going to come out here just because you asked?" I turned back to her, meeting her gaze squarely. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "Yes. Because the owner of this restaurant knows me very well." Her smirk faltered, just barely, but I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For years, Morgan Sinclair had treated me like I was invisible, an unwelcome guest in her son's life. But tonight, she had crossed a line. She'd turned her subtle cruelty into a public spectacle, in front of Adam, his sisters, and an entire room of curious onlookers. The air around us grew thick, charged with tension. I could feel eyes on me, waiting to see what I'd do next. But I didn't waver. Not this time. Because Morgan was about to learn that the outsider she'd spent years underestimating wasn't standing alone anymore. Tonight, the rules had changed, and she was about to find out just how far out of her depth she really was. The maitre d' hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to indulge my request or politely dismiss it. But before he could respond, a deep, familiar voice cut cleanly through the thick tension of the room. Asterisk Claire, asterisk. I turned, and there he was, asterisk Daniel Leon asterisk, the owner of this very restaurant. Even after all these years, he carried the same air of effortless authority that had made him a legend in the city's culinary world. Mid-50s, tall, composed, with salt and pepper hair and a perfectly tailored suit, Daniel was the embodiment of refined elegance. Morgan's confidence faltered for the first time that evening. Her eyes widened ever so slightly as she noticed the way Daniel looked at me, not with dismissal or polite curiosity, but with unmistakable warmth. "Daniel," I greeted, my smile softening but steady. "It's been a while." He returned the smile, his gaze briefly sweeping over to Morgan, then to Adam and his sisters, before settling back on me. "It has," he said smoothly. "What brings you here tonight?" I gestured lightly toward the table where my in-laws sat, their earlier amusement fading into uneasy confusion. "Apparently," I said with a calmness that didn't match the fire in my chest, "I wasn't included in the reservation." "A bit of an oversight, wouldn't you say?" Daniel's expression darkened subtly as he understood the situation. Then, with the grace of a man who'd spent decades navigating power games, he replaced it with a charming, composed smile. "That won't do at all," he said. Morgan gave a sharp, incredulous laugh, folding her arms. "Oh, please. Do you really think this restaurant can just find a seat for her? This is a private dining establishment. You don't just walk in and expect a table." Daniel turned to her, his tone calm but firm. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Sinclair. We don't allow last-minute walk-ins." For a heartbeat, disappointment flickered through me. Then Daniel continued, his voice smooth as silk. "But Claire," he said, looking directly at me, "is not a walk-in." He paused, just long enough for the words to sink in. "She's family." The effect was instant. The entire table froze. Charlotte's wine glass slipped slightly in her fingers, nearly tipping over. Emma's mouth parted in shock, as darting between Daniel and me as if trying to piece together a puzzle. And Adam, my husband, tightened his grip on his silverware until his knuckles went white, yet still said nothing. But Morgan Sinclair never backed down easily. She let out a scoffing laugh, her tone dripping with disbelief. Asterisk family, asterisk oh, this is rich. You must be mistaken. Claire is my son's wife, and I can assure you, she has no connections to. Actually, I interrupted smoothly, my tone even but cutting, Daniel and I go way back. Morgan's eyes narrowed into sharp slits. How, exactly? I took a step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make her lean in, yet loud enough that the nearby tables could still hear every word. "Before I married Adam," I said, holding her gaze steadily, "I helped Daniel design and relaunch this restaurant. I was part of the creative team that built the very image you're so proud to dine in tonight." A hush fell over the room. Daniel gave a small, knowing smile. "And I can assure you, Mrs. Sinclair, this restaurant wouldn't be what it is today without Claire's vision." Morgan's smirk faltered completely, replaced by something she couldn't quite mask, shock, and the faintest hint of embarrassment. For years, she'd treated me like I was beneath her. But in this moment, standing in front of her table, with Daniel Leon himself calling me family in one of the city's most exclusive dining rooms, she finally realized the truth. I wasn't the outsider. I was the woman she had gravely underestimated. "Adam," I began, my tone calm but steady, "I used to work in fine dining. And Daniel, he was my mentor." A stunned silence swept across the table. Even the soft clinking of cutlery from nearby diners seemed to fade away. Morgan's expression froze, her mouth parting as if to argue, but before she could utter a single word, Daniel stepped in. Thomas's voice, low, serious, drifted from behind me as he spoke to one of his colleagues. "The project in San Antonio is almost wrapped up. After that, I'll have more freedom." The colleague chuckled lightly. "You're really discreet about it. Didn't leave any trace, did you?" Thomas took a slow sip of wine, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite read, maybe worry, maybe excitement. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "Everything's under control. San Antonio. A city more than 100 miles away." Thomas had never mentioned any project there. It wasn't part of his territory, not even close. My heart began to pound. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. A rush of cold panic spread through me as I tried to steady my breath, swallowing the wave of anxiety that rose in my throat. That night, on the drive home, Thomas reached for my hand, the same tender gesture he'd done countless times before. To anyone else, it would have looked like the picture of love. But to me, it felt empty. There was no warmth left in that touch, only silence. And deep down, I knew, the doubts I'd been burying could no longer be ignored. I thought I was ready to face whatever changes were happening between us. But then came a phone call that shattered the fragile calm I'd built. It was Allison, my best friend since college, the one person who'd always seen through me. She worked at a media company in Houston now, and that day, just as I set my teacup on the table, my phone rang. Her voice came through the line, hesitant but filled with concern. Morgan's fingers curled tightly into fists against the pristine white tablecloth. "This is absurd," she muttered. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough for only her to hear. "What's absurd," I said, my tone smooth but edged with steel, "is that you thought you could humiliate me in public and get away with it." Her nostrils flared, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You're being dramatic," she spat quietly. I smiled, unbothered, my composure unshaken. "No, Morgan," I whispered back, "I'm just finally letting you see who I've been all along." And for the first time since I'd married into the Sinclair family, she was the one left speechless. I shrugged lightly, a calm smile curving my lips. "I'm just enjoying dinner with my family," I said sweetly. "Isn't that what you wanted?" Before Morgan could snap back, Daniel placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I'll have the chef send over something special for you, Claire." Morgan nearly choked on her wine. Something special, she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. Daniel smiled politely, though there was an unmistakable edge of amusement in his voice. "Of course, on the house, That did it." Morgan's expression tightened, her polished composure splintering as anger flickered behind her carefully painted smile. She could do nothing, but sit there and seethe as Daniel turned to give a quiet instruction to the waiter. Adam reached for his drink, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He still hadn't said a word. But when I glanced his way, I caught it, a fleeting expression that I couldn't quite decipher. Relief? Embarrassment? Maybe even shame. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: the evening was far from over. She had orchestrated this entire charade from the start. It wasn't just about excluding me from dinner, it was about reminding me, in front of everyone, that in her eyes I would always be the outsider. The girl who had worked her way up from nothing. The woman she believed didn't belong at her son's table. I took another slow sip of wine, letting the rich flavor linger before setting the glass down. Then, with a calm smile, I met her gaze. "You say that like it's a bad thing." For the first time that evening, something flickered across Morgan's carefully composed face, annoyance, and perhaps even a hint of surprise. She'd expected me to flinch, to fold under her perfectly aimed cruelty. But I wasn't rattled. Not anymore. "I simply meant," she said, recovering her tone, "that it must have been quite an adjustment for you, marrying into a family like ours." Her voice was light, but the condescension was unmistakable. And Adam, still silent, stared at his plate as if it might save him from having to choose a side. I studied him quietly. The way he avoided my eyes. The way his shoulders tensed, but his mouth stayed shut. And in that moment, it hit me, this wasn't just about her. This was about him. Because this wasn't the first time Morgan had tried to humiliate me. It had happened at our wedding, when she'd accidentally forgotten to invite my side of the family to the rehearsal dinner. It had happened at Christmas, when she'd handed me a cookbook titled Simple Recipes for the Clueless Wife in front of a room full of people. It had happened last summer, when she'd laughed and said how fortunate I was that Adam had taken a chance on me. And every single time, Adam had stayed silent. Every single time. I had told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that keeping the peace was more important than calling out his mother's cruelty. I'd convinced myself that silence was strength, that dignity meant restraint. But this was different. This wasn't a snide remark whispered in private. This was an orchestrated public humiliation, and Adam, my husband, had let it happen. I placed my wine glass down, the soft click punctuating the silence that had settled over the table. The movement was slow, deliberate, measured. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table, my voice smooth and steady. Morgan, I said, meeting her gaze directly, do you know what the difference is between you and me? The table went still. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. Emma glanced at Adam, but he didn't look up. Morgan tilted her head slightly, that brittle smile still plastered on her face. I smiled back, calm, poised, and entirely in control. Because for the first time since I married into this family, I was the one holding the power. Morgan tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes despite herself. The difference, she asked, her tone guarded, careful. I smiled, a calm, measured smile that didn't reach my eyes. I worked for everything I have. A stunned silence fell over the table. The kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, tighter. Morgan's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin, controlled line. Excuse me, she said finally, voice sharp. I didn't blink. You heard me. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the tension rippling through her posture. Emma pressed her lips together, her eyes darting between us as if trying to stifle an involuntary laugh. Morgan gave a cold scoff. Are you trying to imply that I haven't worked for what I have? I let her question hang in the air for a moment, long enough for the discomfort to grow, for the sound of distant clinking silverware to echo from another table. Then, before she could recover her footing, I leaned forward slightly, my tone still calm, but laced with quiet authority. I didn't marry into wealth, I said. I didn't inherit status. I built my career from the ground up. Every late night, every rejection, every risk, I earned it. And yet, I gestured lightly toward the table, my gaze sweeping across the glittering crystal, the elegant plates, the uneasy faces of my in-laws. Here we are, sitting in the same restaurant, eating the same food, treated with the same respect by the owner. The words hung between us like glass, sharp, reflective, impossible to ignore. Morgan's fingers tightened around her napkin, the white linen crumpling beneath her grasp. Charlotte's usual smirk was gone. Emma's eyes flicked toward Adam, who looked as though he might sink into the floor if given the chance. For the first time since I had met Morgan Sinclair, I saw something flicker across her face, something raw and unguarded. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Because for years, she had clung to the narrative that I didn't belong, that I was the outsider, the gold digger, the woman her son had foolishly chosen from beneath their social class. But now, as she sat there surrounded by witnesses in silence, she was beginning to understand the truth. I was not someone she could break. I picked up my fork, casually slicing into my dish again, every movement deliberate and unhurried. Oh, and Morgan, I said, glancing up at her. She exhaled sharply through her nose, her patience thinning, her fury barely contained. What? She snapped. I smiled slowly, almost kindly. You should be careful about who you look down on. Then, I lifted a bite of food to my lips, paused for just a second, and added, you never know who might end up above you. The tension at the table was suffocating now, thick enough to drown in. Charlotte's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Emma avoided eye contact entirely. Adam's silence was deafening. And Morgan Sinclair, the ever-composed, ever-powerful matriarch, sat completely still, her jaw clenched, her fingers coiled so tightly around her wine glass that I half expected it to shatter in her hand. For the first time, she wasn't in control. And she knew it. Adam looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat, his shoulders sinking lower with every passing second. Charlotte and Emma exchanged uneasy glances, silently debating whether they should step in or stay out of it entirely. The air between us was dense, charged, and for the first time since this dinner began, I felt completely certain of my place. I saw it in Morgan's face, the tiny, almost imperceptible crack in her perfectly constructed facade. The mask of superiority she'd worn so effortlessly had slipped, if only for a moment. She wasn't used to being challenged. Her power had always come from control, from the way people bent under her tone, the way they smiled politely while swallowing their pride. But me? I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Morgan took a slow, measured breath, forcing composure back into her posture. Then, with a calm so deliberate it felt rehearsed, she placed her wine glass back on the table with a soft click. I see, she said finally, her voice silk smooth but laced with venom. I suppose I should commend you, Clara. You've managed to elevate yourself, beyond your circumstances. I took another sip of wine, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. My expression stayed cool, detached. But Morgan wasn't done. Her lips curved into a saccharine smile, sweet enough to poison. Tell me, she continued, tilting her head slightly, if you're so independent, so self-made, why is it that my son is the one paying for your lifestyle? The words cut through the quiet like glass breaking. I froze for half a second, then set my glass down, my movement slow, deliberate, controlled. Charlotte gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Emma shifted in her seat, eyes darting between us. Adam flinched, his discomfort now impossible to hide. Morgan's smile sharpened, her eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. She could feel the balance of the room tip back in her favor, or at least she thought she could. What do you mean by that? I asked evenly, though I could feel the heat rising beneath my calm exterior. Morgan leaned forward, lowering her voice to a mock whisper. I mean, darling, that my son is the reason you can afford that charming little boutique job of yours, isn't he? You don't need to work, but you play pretend at having a career. She let out a quiet laugh, smooth and cruel. How quaint. Her tone dripped with disdain as she continued, you speak so highly of self-sufficiency, but at the end of the day, you're still just someone my son supports. And there it was. Her final card, the insult meant to humiliate me. The dagger she'd been holding back all evening, waiting for the perfect moment to twist. But what she didn't realize was that I had stopped bleeding from her kind of wounds a long time ago. Beyond recovery, this was supposed to be her finishing move, the final blow meant to put me back in my place. I let the words hang in the air, watching the scene unfold around me like a perfectly staged play. Adam still wouldn't look at me, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. Charlotte and Emma sat stiffly, their expressions tight, expectant, waiting for me to crumble. Waiting for me to shrink back into silence. Instead, I laughed. Not a polite, nervous chuckle. Not the kind of laugh you give when you're trying to smooth over tension. No, this was a full, unrestrained, genuine laugh. The sound of it startled the entire table. Morgan's smirk faltered, her brow tightening in confusion. I'm sorry, she said slowly, her tone clipped. Is something funny? I placed my napkin back on the table, still laughing softly. Oh, I just realized how truly out of touch you are, Morgan. Her eyes narrowed. Excuse me. I gestured toward Adam, my voice calm and measured. You think he supports me? I arched a brow. That's adorable. Charlotte made a small choking sound. Emma's lips parted, speechless. And Adam went pale, the color draining from his face, as if he'd been caught in a secret he didn't know how to explain. Morgan's smirk vanished. What are you talking about? She demanded. I sighed, almost pitying her. You still see Adam as your little boy, don't you? The one in control. The provider. The man who rescued me from my so-called humble beginnings. I tilted my head slightly. But that's not how this marriage works, Morgan. Her posture stiffened, her composure starting to slip. You want to know what's really funny? I continued, my voice smooth, every word deliberate. Half of Adam's business investments, the ones you're so proud of, were funded with my money. A stunned silence crashed over the table. Morgan's eyes widened, her entire expression collapsing into disbelief. What? She whispered, her voice cracking. I smiled, but this time there was no warmth behind it. Adam didn't build his career alone, I said evenly, my gaze flicking briefly to my husband, who still sat frozen in place. When he wanted to start investing, he didn't have the capital. But I did. I lifted my wine glass, swirling the liquid lazily before taking a sip. Morgan's fingers twitched against the tablecloth. That's not possible. I shrugged. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night. But the reality is simple, your son's success was built on my investments, my strategies, and my support. Charlotte and Emma turned to Adam, their eyes silently demanding confirmation. But Adam said nothing. He couldn't. He just sat there pale and still, caught between shame and disbelief. And for the first time since this dinner began, it wasn't me who looked small in Morgan Sinclair's eyes. It was her son. I shook my head slowly, a small, incredulous laugh escaping my lips. You think you can humiliate me by painting me as some dependent little housewife? I said, meeting Morgan's eyes with cool defiance. That's laughable. Because the truth, Morgan, I paused, letting the silence stretch, is that Adam needs me far more than I will ever need him. A deep flush crept up Morgan's neck, her carefully applied composure unraveling. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, my voice calm but razor-sharp. You've spent years trying to make me feel like I don't belong. Like I'm some outsider you can manipulate or belittle. But the irony is, I gestured faintly toward Adam, I've been the one keeping this marriage, and by extension your precious family name, afloat. The words hit like a slap. Emma's eyes went wide, her face pale as if she were about to faint. Charlotte, usually full of witty remarks, sat frozen in utter silence. And Adam, dear, quiet Adam, finally opened his mouth. Claire, he croaked, voice thin and uncertain. Maybe we should. I raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. No, Adam. My tone was firm, steady. You don't get to maybe we should me right now. Not after you sat here in silence while your mother tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. The words seemed to hang between us, heavy and final. Morgan's gaze snapped to her son, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. The pride she usually reserved for him was gone, replaced by disappointment. She looked at Adam not as her golden boy, but as a man who had just proven himself weak. Small. And that asterisk, was the sweetest twist of all. I stood up, smoothing down the fabric of my dress, every movement deliberate and controlled. I think I'm done here, I said evenly. Morgan's nostrils flared. You can't just. I turned before she could finish, addressing Daniel, who had been standing a polite distance away, watching everything unfold with quiet amusement. Daniel, I said, offering him a small, graceful smile. It was lovely seeing you. Thank you for the hospitality. He inclined his head, returning the smile. Always a pleasure, Claire. Then, I turned to Adam. You coming? He hesitated, of course he did, his gaze darting from me to his mother, torn between defiance and the same old fear that had always kept him in her shadow. And in that moment I saw it. The answer written all over his face. I knew exactly what he was going to do. Because Adam had never chosen me before. And he wasn't about to start now. Morgan's smile returned, smug and triumphant, as if she'd just won. But I smiled right back, slow, deliberate, knowing. Because what she didn't realize was that I'd already made my choice too. And very soon, both she and Adam were going to regret ever trying to put me in my place, because they were about to find out exactly how powerful I truly was. I really wasn't surprised that Adam didn't follow me. Deep down, I hadn't expected him to. As I stepped outside the restaurant, the cool night air wrapped around me like a quiet whisper of freedom. For the first time in years, my mind felt clear, sharp, steady, focused. The sting of humiliation that Morgan had intended for me had burned away into something far stronger. Resolve. Tonight hadn't been a disaster. It had been a reckoning, one that was long overdue. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and unlocked it with a calmness that almost startled me. My fingers didn't tremble. They moved with precision, purpose, inevitability. I opened my messages and typed a single line. Me asterisk, we're moving forward. Initiate the process first thing tomorrow, asterisk. It took only seconds for the reply to appear. Attorney asterisk, understood. You'll have the first draft of the divorce settlement by noon, asterisk. I stared at the words for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. Divorce. It didn't scare me. What scared me was how long I'd let myself pretend that everything was fine. That Adam was my partner. That his silence was love, or loyalty, or even weakness. But it wasn't, it was indifference. And I had built my strength in the shadow of that indifference for years. Not anymore. Tonight had been the final push I needed. And as for Morgan, she had no idea that the game she thought she'd won was already lost. Because she might have humiliated me in front of her family, but soon, I'd dismantle everything she thought she controlled. Piece by piece. When I reached home, the house was still. Adam wasn't there yet. Perfect. I slipped off my heels and walked straight to the home office, the one he called his space, though everything inside it had my fingerprints all over it. The smell of leather and paper filled the air as I stepped inside, eyes settling on the mahogany desk and the small black safe tucked behind it. The code. He'd never changed it. I smiled faintly. Of course he hadn't. I knelt down, keyed in the numbers, and heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Inside were the documents that truly defined Adam Sinclair, the man his mother worshipped as a financial prodigy. Bank statements. Investment portfolios. Partnership agreements. And there it was. The one I'd been looking for. A thick, bound contract bearing both our signatures. The one that legally tied his most successful investment, the foundation of his so-called empire, to my initial capital. I traced my fingers lightly across the page, scanning the familiar clauses. This single document was proof of everything I'd said tonight. Proof that I had been the financial backbone of Adam's entire empire. Morgan thought her son was a self-made man. But without me, he was nothing but an illusion built on borrowed confidence and my money. I took a quiet, deliberate photo of the contract, ensuring every page was captured clearly. Then I placed it back exactly where I found it. No need to take it, proof was power, and I already had what I needed. As I stood, I caught my reflection in the glass of a framed photograph, Adam and me smiling at a charity gala 2 years ago. My expression in the photo was soft, trusting. His arm rested around my shoulders like a claim. I stared at it for a long moment before turning away. The next stop was the bedroom. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary, but had long since turned into a silent battleground. And tonight, it would be the stage for the first move in the war Adam and Morgan didn't even know had begun. I pulled out a suitcase and began to pack. Not in anger. Not in haste. But with absolute clarity. Every folded blouse, every carefully placed pair of shoes was an act of quiet finality. This wasn't an impulsive escape. This was strategy. A calculated departure, years in the making. By the time Adam finally walked through the front door, the house was silent except for the faint hum of the clock on the wall. I was sitting on the couch, suitcase beside me, waiting. He froze in the doorway as if unsure whether he'd stepped into the right home. "Claire," he said hesitantly. I tilted my head. "Took you long enough." His gaze flicked to the suitcase, then back to me, confusion crossing his features. "What are you doing?" I rose slowly, my voice steady. "Leaving." The color drained from his face. "Leaving?" He let out a shaky laugh, the kind people use when they think they can still control the narrative. "Claire, come on, let's just talk about this." I stepped closer, my tone cool, unwavering. "You made your choice, Adam. Back there at the restaurant, when your mother humiliated me again, and you sat there. Just like always." His jaw tightened. I was trying to keep the peace. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Peace? Adam, that wasn't peace. That was cowardice." He flinched. "Your mother planned that entire dinner," I continued, my voice rising only slightly. "She booked a reservation and made sure I wasn't on it. She mocked me, belittled me, tried to strip me of every ounce of dignity I had left, and you let her." He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting away. "You know how she is. It's complicated." "No," I cut in sharply. "It's simple." I took another step closer, meeting his gaze head-on. "You're weak." His eyes snapped up to mine, stung by the word. But it was the truth, and we both knew it. "You've spent our entire marriage letting your mother dictate how you treat me," I said quietly. "I was patient, Adam. I gave you chance after chance. But tonight," I shook my head, the final piece clicking into place. "Tonight, I finally saw you for what you are." He swallowed hard. "Claire, please. Let's just talk about this." I sighed, picking up the handle of my suitcase. "That's the problem, Adam. There's nothing left to say." I brushed past him, the scent of his cologne faint and familiar, a reminder of the man I once thought he could be. My fingers closed around the door handle. And then his voice, low, sharp, desperate, cut through the air. "I'll fight you on this." I paused, turning slowly. "What?" Adam's face had hardened, a glint of defiance replacing his earlier guilt. "If you think you're walking away from this marriage with half of everything, you're mistaken." For a moment, there was silence. Then I smiled, cold, controlled, almost pitying. "Oh, Adam," I said softly. "You still don't understand, do you?" I stepped closer, my heels clicking against the marble floor. "Half of everything. I built everything. Those investments you brag about. The business deals your mother flaunts at parties. They exist because of me." His jaw tightened, but I didn't stop. "So go ahead," I said, voice low and razor sharp. "Fight me. Because by the time I'm done, you'll realize that the only thing you ever truly owned in this marriage was my patience. And with that, I opened the door and left without looking back. I stared at him for a long moment, then smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made the color in his face fade even more. "Oh, Adam," I said softly, almost pitying. "You really should start reading your own contracts more carefully." Confusion flickered in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" I cut him off, my tone razor-sharp but calm. "You wouldn't even have half of what you own if it weren't for me. Every major investment you've ever made, your firm, your properties, your so-called portfolio, was built with my money." His mouth opened but no sound came out. And guess what? I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment as his expression shifted from disbelief to dread. "I have every document, every signature, every wire transfer to prove it." Adam's face went pale. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a low, deliberate whisper. "I let you borrow my money, Adam. I let you build something with it. But now," I smiled, a sharp, quiet smile that held no warmth. "Now I want it back." The words hit him like a physical blow. Adam stumbled back a step, his composure unraveling. I could see the exact moment the realization dawned, the truth that I wasn't bluffing, that I wasn't just leaving him. I was dismantling the illusion of power he'd built around himself. He stood frozen in the doorway, jaw clenched, hands trembling slightly at his sides. I had seen that look before, the moment someone realizes the game is over and they've already lost. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to plead. But I didn't give him the chance. "I'll be staying at the penthouse," I said simply, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder. His brows drew together in confusion. "What penthouse?" I tilted my head, feigning mild surprise. "Oh, Adam, the one you think you own." For a split second, he didn't understand. And then I saw it, the panic flickering in his eyes as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. "The downtown penthouse?" he asked, voice breaking. The one you bought under my name," I finished smoothly. "Yes. That one." His face twisted in disbelief. "You're lying." "Am I?" I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, tossing it onto the counter between us. "Go ahead. See for yourself." He hesitated, then snatched it up and tore it open. His eyes moved rapidly over the document, his breathing growing shallow. "This," he stammered, swallowing hard. "This says you own 51% of my investment firm." "Correct," I said evenly. "Majority shareholder." "Which means your firm isn't yours anymore." The envelope slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the quiet hum of the house, the faint ticking of the clock, and the sound of his world collapsing around him. I stepped forward one last time, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. "You should have thought twice before letting your mother try to destroy me, Adam." Because the thing about underestimating someone, I paused, meeting his eyes, is that you never see it coming when they take everything back. And with that, I turned toward the door, leaving him standing there amidst the wreckage of his own arrogance, silent, shaken, and suddenly very, very small. I nodded slowly. "Correct." Adam's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling as if the air had suddenly become too thin. That's impossible," he stammered. I shrugged lightly. "Not really. I was the initial investor, remember? I never transferred ownership over to you. You just assumed I did because," I tilted my head, smiling faintly, "you never actually read the contracts, did you?" Panic spread across his face like a slow, creeping shadow. I could see his mind racing, scrambling to understand how everything had slipped so far out of his control. Claire," he managed, his voice tight, trembling. "You can't just take this from me." "I'm not taking anything," I said calmly, almost gently. "I already own it." He staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for balance. The irony wasn't lost on me, this man who had once allowed his mother to humiliate me, who sat in silence as she stripped me of my dignity, was now standing before me, stripped of his own power. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why? Why are you doing this?" For a moment, I just looked at him, the man I had once loved, the man I had once believed in. And then, with a quiet certainty, I said, "Because, Adam, I finally see my worth." And with that, I turned and walked out of the house for the last time. A month later, I sat in the penthouse, penthouse, legs crossed, a glass of champagne in hand. The city glittered beneath the evening sky, and for the first time in years, I felt the calm that comes with true freedom. Across from me, my attorney smiled as she slid a stack of neatly bound papers across the marble table. "It's official," she said. "You're free." I exhaled slowly, tracing a finger along the edge of the divorce decree. "Free," I repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, fast, brutal, and strangely satisfying. Adam had tried to fight, of course. He had stormed into legal meetings, demanded better terms, threatened to drag things to court. But the moment my lawyers presented the documents proving I was the majority shareholder of his firm, his arrogance cracked like thin glass. And then came Morgan. She'd called me in a rage, her voice sharp and venomous through the phone. "You're a gold-digging snake," she'd screamed. I had simply replied, "If you'd raised him better, this wouldn't have happened." Then I hung up and blocked her number, because Morgan Sinclair was no longer my problem. I took another sip of champagne, savoring the quiet satisfaction that filled the room. And then, as if the universe wanted to gift me one last laugh, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Adam. "Adam *, can we talk?" I smirked and set the glass down, thumbs moving over the screen. "Me * about what?" There was a long pause. Then, "Adam *, I don't know what to do, *." I stared at the message for a moment, a soft sigh leaving my lips. How ironic. For years, I had waited for him to show up, to be the man I believed I married. I had waited for him to stand up to his mother, to fight for me the way I had fought for him. But now I saw him clearly, for what he truly was. A man who had spent his life hiding behind the power of others. A man too weak to build anything on his own. And now, when his empire was crumbling, he needed me more than ever. But I didn't need him at all. I typed one final message. "Me *, that's not my problem anymore." Then I blocked his number. I leaned back in my chair, a calm smile curving my lips as the city lights reflected off the glass walls around me. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And that, more than any victory or revenge, was the most powerful thing I had ever done.